probably already heard, the City Council voted overwhelmingly to enact the mayor's proposed ordinance with slight modifications to regulate the short-term rental market. It's been about, what, 2 or 3 years in the making. Many stakeholders have been lobbying very aggressively to get their opinions heard, and it's probably not a perfect piece of legislation, but it definitely provides some governance and addresses a number of the key issues that have been raised by many concerned residents in the city. So I just want to comment that it should be noted for the record that this ordinance probably either wouldn't have passed when it did yesterday, or would look very different from the form that it eventually took if it weren't for the tireless efforts of Ford Cavalieri in his capacity as the chair of ADCO, the Alliance of Downtown Civic Organizations. He's worked with NEWRA and all of our counterparts throughout the downtown neighborhoods to not just lobby City Hall, but to really advocate for the residents' concerns about the short-term rental marketplace and the pervasiveness of it that's taken place over the last couple of years. So we should be very proud to have Ford as a neighbor, and when you get a chance after the meeting, you should go up and thank him for all his efforts on behalf of all of us. I'm going to, since Lydia was instrumental also in passing legislation, I'm going to ask Michael to comment on the legislation. Would you like to do that before or after Ford speaks?
We can go after Ford.
Okay, so I've asked Ford to give us the details about the ordinance that was passed yesterday. I mentioned before it's somewhat different from the initial ordinance that the mayor proposed, and there were several amendments that were put forth at the City Council meeting yesterday. Many were voted down, some of them were approved. So if you could just go over maybe first briefly the details of the ordinance, what it does, what it doesn't do, and then you were kind enough to work up some numbers for us as well as to what the immediate impact might look like in the neighborhood.
This was a group effort. ADCO, as you guys may know, the Alliance of Downtown Civic Organizations, when I was president here, I was vice chair of ADCO. I took over ADCO when the prior chair, who was from Back Bay, stepped down. And ADCO is has representatives from the 9 largest neighborhood associations of the downtown area, from Fenway to Chinatown, from the north end to the south end. So we try to identify issues that are citywide in impact, certainly downtown-wide, often citywide. For this effort, we were actually joined by a whole coalition of folks, a bunch of the community development corporations in Fenway and Jamaica Plain, the Southwest Community Development Organization, Chinatown Progressive Organization was instrumental in part of this, as were some of the hotel unions who were actually not actively participating with us, but providing moral support and certainly people coming to the meetings. So I wanted to just thank this large coalition, and really I don't want to short what the hotel folks did. I think Local 26 is an excellent outfit, and it's funny because for the BRA urban renewal zones, we were sort of on opposite sides battling each other. It was nice to have them on our side. I'm not looking forward to battling them later again, but probably will happen. Frenemies, I guess. So I wanted to sort of compare and contrast what happened yesterday in the City Council and with the original ordinance as filed by the mayor in February, and then the second one that was filed about 4 or 5 weeks ago. The original ordinance was actually pretty good by standards of some other cities, but it let a lot of people stay in the market, and it put a cap of 90 days on everyone. So large-scale investors would stay in the market. And now that was a problem for Boston because we actually have 4 times as many institutional investors doing Airbnb fake hotels as any other city that we surveyed. And I was sort of shocked to find that out, but we did a lot of research and looked at other cities. And we had a much worse problem in Boston because we had done no regulation since the problem was first identified in 2014. Where San Francisco and some other cities had actually done regulations that sort of worked but sort of didn't, and they stumbled and they changed them. We did nothing. So that's what you get if you do nothing, and that's an interesting lesson. So the mayor did this first resolution, but we convinced a bunch of folks, the whole coalition. It really wasn't great to keep the investors in the marketplace because the investors were really our problem, and we had such a concentration of them, we really needed to roll them back. And at the same time, we had identified that three of the operators, Sonder and Stay Alfred, Domio, which some of you may remember as Anthony in the North End with that nice picture of this guy being hugged by his wife. Fake, it was actually a picture that they bought from Getty Images. There is no Anthony. And it was actually a New York-based company that's trying to do an IPO just like Sonder. All of them are trying to do essentially a fake hotel IPO. And if you read the materials they have to Wall Street, they're basically saying the next generation of hotels is not like a Hilton building, but it's those apartments in neighborhoods, and we're going to pick every building off and have you can stay in every building. Terrible from a neighborhood perspective, and I think a lot of the city councilors felt the same. So the mayor went back and he came up with another ordinance. Michelle Wu was very key. I want to call her out and give her a shout out. She was key in getting the new ordinance drafted, as was Lydia. Actually, we worked very closely with Joyce Linehan in the mayor's office and Housing Chief Sheila Dillon. All of these folks were very engaged. And we were doing a lot of number sharing, and it was very collaborative between us and the city council and the administration. It was a good experience. So essentially an ordinance got agreed to, or at least the mayor decided, okay, I can buy into this, I'll submit it, but it still went through the machinations in the city council, and there were some changes made at the last minute. It went through committee, one provision for a particular cap got pulled off, but then it went into an amendment process yesterday. It was actually sort of neat to see the city council acting as a legislature, which they're sort of supposed to be for the city. They had, I think, 9 amendments, votes, and they went through them in a very orderly fashion. Committee, city council president, Andrea Campbell, I think was a little miffed by a Herald headline that said that there were going to be fireworks at yesterday's council hearing. There were no fireworks, and she even referenced, like, there aren't going to be any fireworks here, and she controlled it very nicely. So what we ended up getting is a resolution that essentially bans investors from Boston. And so if you are not a resident owner, you can't have an Airbnb in the city. If you're a tenant, you can't be on Airbnb. If you're not a resident, like if you live in Florida for 6 months and you decided to have residency there and you own some property here and you want to put it on Airbnb, you can't. You have to be a resident of the city of Boston, owner-occupied, in building. Now there is the residency requirement is actually fairly strict. You need to be in residence in Boston for 270 days in order to qualify as a resident for the purposes of this ordinance. So essentially there is a de facto 90-day cap on Airbnbs because of the residency requirement. Now that cap is not going to be in place for triple deckers, where you'll have a couple of units. You can be in residence, but this is sort of another unit. It's not going to be in effect if you have a huge single family and you've put an in-law apartment up in the attic and you want to make that into an Airbnb. You can rent those 365 days a year. But the intention was, we want to make sure that people are not actually either fake residents, and also we want to make sure that if there are going to be folks that are going to have more than 90 days of rentals, that there's always someone on site, so we don't have these horror stories of wild parties or crazy things happening at Airbnbs. So that's sort of where the ordinance came out. There were a couple of amendments that, as I mentioned, that came into the floor. A couple of amendments that would have really watered it down. One, in committee, there was a move that was shepherded by a lot of the outer district councilors to say, let's not have any cap on if you're a 2 or 3 family home. let's not have any cap on the number of days that you could do in one of those units. Originally, there was a cap of 120 days. That was taken off. There was an attempt to put it back in during the amendment process, failed by 1 vote. I actually, my feeling is that the outer district councilors, all of whom voted for it, really want that for their neighborhoods, they can have it. We in the North End have very, very few 2- and 3-family units. So it doesn't affect us, it doesn't affect the rest of downtown. I think there are 470 2- and 3-family units in all of downtown, whereas there are 17,000 of these units that would be eligible for this kind of unit in all of Boston. So, if the outer districts want it, they get it. But there were some neat things added in the amendment process. I think there was the most importantly, and I want to give a shout out to Matt O'Malley, who stepped up. He's sort of an honorary, I feel that he's sort of, even though he's District 6, he's essentially Jamaica Plain, and all that. He really stepped up and did things that were really helpful for downtown. One of the things that we now have because of Matt's amendment is a review process where we're going to take a very hard look every 6 months at the housing impact. Because the whole reason that we didn't want short-term rentals is that, as you guys probably have seen, you have big companies like this Domio outfit or Sonder suck up leases, and the young people, the professionals who want to move to Boston and get an apartment, they can't find an apartment, our vacancy rate goes down, and our rents go up. And so we become not a city of residents, but a city of tourists, rolling around bags. So there are some concerns that we're still not going to have that totally addressed, but every 6 months there are a couple of metrics we're going to look at, the disparity between how much money people are making in the short-term market and the long-term market, the occupancy rates, the rent rates by neighborhood, and so there are going to be some remedial measures that are going to be a constant, there's going to be constant monitoring, and that's going to be run by ISD and Sheila Dillon's housing group. So that's really good news. As far as the North End goes, I just ran the numbers very quickly, and I wanted to share this with you guys. Depending on whose numbers you believe, and it's hard to get Airbnb numbers, as you guys know, the North End probably, and I'm not talking about room rentals, which are largely left alone by this ordinance, but entire apartment rentals, like on Airbnb an entire flat. The number of those that are available right now, this is as of last November in the North End, was somewhere between 172 and 189. So those are baseline numbers that we have. We suspect that it's gone up by about 25% since then, so the numbers are actually higher. But let's use these numbers as the baseline. In that, let's take the lowest number, 172. If you look at the owner-occupied bar it has to meet, we know, based on the analysis that's done, that 62% of the units immediately would be disqualified that are currently Airbnbs. There'd be a 33% more that, it's not obvious whether there's a resident living there or not, but those would go. Potentially, there's a potential, a number of them might go. I would say probably, you can split the difference and say half. The only units that are currently Airbnbs that actually have a resident, and I counted it, and I've counted it again because I wanted to verify it, 8. So potentially, if the 37 units, or the 33% of the units are we don't know if they're owner occupied, but if we verify that they're not, we could go down from the 190 mark to about 10 Airbnbs allowed in the North End.
Before, even if it's resident owner occupied, there's a limit as to how many, if there's more than 2 or 3 units in the building, then they're also not allowed to rent it out, isn't that correct?
Well, if you're owner occupied and you're a resident of the city of Boston, and you're there, and in whatever configuration of building you have the option. It's a very resident-friendly bill. You have the option to Airbnb the unit if you're a resident of Boston and you own the unit, you can do it in
Well,
whatever
You
configuration.
can do your own unit
You can do
without
your
any
own unit.
restriction. But what if you're in a building that has more than 2 or 3 additional units?
Well, I think what you're talking about is the 2 or 3 family.
Right.
And the 2 or 3 family, so I ran the numbers on 2 or 3 families. Remember, downtown has like less than 500 and the rest of Boston has almost 20,000 of these eligible units. So, but there are some eligible units here. I looked at how many 2 and 3 family units we have right now. There were only 10 units on Airbnb for entire apartment rental, only 10 as of the November 2017 cut that we did. 2 of them were 2 families and 8 of them were 3 families. The ones that would survive this ordinance, only 3 of them.
That are owner occupied?
Yeah, because most of the 2 and 3 families in the North End are not owner occupied. And it's very important to also underscore, 2 and 3 families have this opportunity to have an additional unit. Like you can live there in unit 1 and you can Airbnb out unit 2. If you have a 2-family or a 3-family, and you don't have a limit. 4 to 6 units, or the 8+ unit now at Chief Street, none of those building configurations can you do this. That's only an exception for 2 and 3 family units, which we don't have a whole lot of in the North End. So if you have a 4 to 6, and even if you own it and you live there and you're getting a property tax exemption because you're an owner occupant, you cannot do the second unit. You can do your own unit though. You can do your own unit as long as you're there for 270 days. So it's a tremendous change. It will. And I want to. Last thing I want to say is it's not as tight as some of the ordinances that have passed in other cities like San Francisco and Nashville over the past 6 months. And it's certainly not what's going on in New Orleans as of 2 weeks ago, where they tried to do a more friendly Airbnb regulation, a more friendly ordinance. They passed it last year. And it turned out it didn't work, and they just had to ban Airbnbs entirely in the downtown New Orleans area. So they had to do an emergency ban of Airbnbs. This is really this was designed by Mayor Walsh and by his people and by the city council to be friendly to residents. If you need to rent your unit out and you really feel like you want to do two or 3 months in Florida and you want to have your unit on the market, you can do that. But if you're trying to build a fake hotel business, you're stopped dead in the water, and that was the design intent of this. So,
Well, what's the enforcement mechanism? Yeah, right.
What's the enforcement?
well, the enforcement mechanism is ISD and Department of Neighborhood Development, DND, which is Sheila Dillon's, are going to both have a hand in enforcement. DND will probably be looking at numbers. Sheila Dillon has been doing a lot of work. She always looks at the housing supply, and her job is to make sure that we don't have a housing crisis in Boston. And so she's trying to help the mayor and his announced goals of building more housing. So what this group is going to do, and right now they have an RFP out to data vendors. Remember, this won't take effect until January 1st. So there's a time frame when systems are going to be built and processes are going to be put in place. But what the RFP is going to allow ISD to effectively either build or buy a system, which is going to interface, we hope, with the Airbnb system. That's going to, number one, make it so that you're locked out of going onto the Airbnb system as a host unless you are registered in the city of Boston and you meet the city of Boston criteria. And number two, if you exceed your number of days, you'll be shut down. If you are an unregistered, if you're not supposed to register, ideally you won't be able to register. Now, there are many in City Hall that are expecting that Airbnb is not going to be very friendly to the city when the city asks to have this interlock with the system. By the way, San Francisco has the interlock. San Francisco is the model that we're going after. San Francisco had to spend quite a bit of time in court to get that. But the nice thing is, and I look over to Patrick, the nice thing is that both the House and the Senate state bills had this information sharing requirement built into them. So it stands to reason that in the conference committee, which is supposed to reconcile two versions that both have this ingredient, that ingredient will survive. And a lot of us are reckoning, when you ask the important question about enforcement, yeah, Airbnb might sue Boston, probably not going to sue Maura Healy, because this is going to be the first time statewide that there's an information sharing requirement. So that is really great. I mean, we're still looking forward to the legislature statewide bill passing, but I mean, that works really in favor of the city. And I actually think, frankly, I've spoken to the administration. I said, you know, if San Francisco won, so you can win too. So, you know, so that's, I hope that answers the question. The reason that this ordinance was so important for Boston, I talk about the investors and all that, but the thing everyone should realize is the economic, if you own a building, you know, you're John Carlos' client, what's his name?
Peter McGinnis.
Yes, Peter McGinnis, okay, Peter McGinnis. Let's not make it Peter McGinnis, because, you know, I don't want, let's just say you're a Peter McGinnis-like person, but you just want to make as much money as you can. In doing Airbnb or HomeAway or Flipkey or any of the, you know, the short-term rental model, you will make 4 times as much money easy. In some neighborhoods in Boston, based on our break-even analysis, you can make 8 times as much money doing Airbnb. So if you don't have a regulatory, if you don't have some regulations, everyone is going to switch to Airbnb. And that actually happened in Italian cities like Venice, where they didn't have any regulations. There are no residents left in that city right now.
But
So-
we have the right, if we own our own condo in the 10 unit, we have the right as trustees to put down in the rules that you cannot make it.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, you can make it more restrictive in your building, but you can't make it less restrictive. I mean, it will always be the 270-day residential requirement. You won't be able to register on many of these platforms, hopefully, to even do, you know, be a host unless you are a resident of Boston and you actually do live here. The average in the North End is probably around $250 to $290.
Yes,
Around
around
for
300.
yeah. So I mean, you know, so yeah, if you can find a bargain like $95, it probably has no windows and it's like 10 stories underground. But you can sometimes you can find a bargain. One bargain that you find sometimes in the North End is there are people that have cabins on boats that are docked, and they Airbnb them out. So you know, you get that for $95.
So I just have one more question for Ford, and then we're going to ask Michael to speak on behalf of Councilor Edwards, who was again instrumental in getting this ordinance passed. So there'll be an immediate impact as of January 1st in the downtown neighborhoods where these corporate hotels essentially are going to be outlawed and banned. The next biggest impact is likely to be the adjoining neighborhoods, East Boston, Allston, Brighton. Where do you think any of this removed supply of short-term rentals is going to be displaced to, you know?
Well, you know, the worry about removing the 120-day cap was that we're going to pick up 2,000 housing units approximately, based on this regulation and the bigger, you know, the big hotels.
Investor units.
The investor units. The investor units going away. You pick up 2,000 housing units that go back into the housing supply, and they will go back into the housing supply. This happened in Berlin. Not only did they pick up all the Airbnb units, they actually picked up an equal number of units that had been just left vacant because the owners didn't want to rent them because they wanted later to make them into Airbnbs. So we're probably going to pick up more than 2,000 units. But the problem is, if you have uncapped rentals in some of the outer districts, you could actually lose the 2,000 back to the Airbnbs. And we're worried, you know, like, and that's why Matt O'Malley's amendment was so important. Because in Dorchester, which has a lot of 2 and 3 families, and also has a lot of people that need, working class folks that, you know, need to find an apartment, you don't want to take the primary supply of their apartments, which are 2 and 3, you know, triple deckers.
Affordably.
You don't want to take them out of the market, and they're not affordable in the sense that they're subsidized, but they're, you know, a good market rate, you know, a good cheap, you know, you're working, you're starting on your career or whatever, you can move to Roslindale and get a place, you can move to Dorchester, but all of those places could have these Airbnbs go in. That's why it's important to monitor at 6-month intervals, and if there is some sort of ramp up, and we're looking like we're just shifting the problem to the outer districts, there'll be more moves that are made.
Thank you for it. In the interest of time, if anyone has any more questions about the ordinance or the impact on the neighborhood, I'll ask Ford if you wouldn't mind staying around for a few minutes after we convene. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Michael. You have some comments for us?
I'll be very brief. Councilor Edwards joined the council in voting to pass the legislation on short-term rentals. So this legislation will allow owner occupants to list their own unit, a part of their unit, or an adjacent whole unit in their building. Prohibits ownership or operation of a short-term rental by outside investors. And something that the council was very staunch on was creating a public registry of short-term rentals with ISD. And the council made a comment, this legislation balances the rights of homeowners to earn supplemental income with protections for housing stock under pressure from the investor-owned segment of the short-term rental industry. And that's it.
Any questions for Michael?
What was the registry?
It's going to be a public registry of short-term rentals in the city. It's going to be run by Inspection Services Department.
That's really important, by the way.
Free up from the Airbnb universe, I'm just trying to keep my universes straight.
Yeah.
For the Airbnb versus units that are now available for rental because they can't be Airbnb.
The registry is only going to be units that have been registered to be short-term rentals. So, currently, right now, the world is like, you don't know if there's an Airbnb next to you. You see suitcases rolling, you see a lockbox, you suspect, but Airbnb doesn't even tell you where their units are. They have this sort of circle of uncertainty around it because they don't want to disclose where units are. That practice comes to a dead halt by this ordinance, and all that information is made public. So back to the question of enforcement, one of the best enforcement mechanisms for zoning violations and for a lot of stuff is groups like this. If you read the registry and say, oh my God, that unit next to me is an Airbnb, and you notice that it's operating 365 days, not just 90 days, you can call ISD and they'll come down and fix it. So that's a really great point. So I'm glad Michael mentioned that. I forgot.
I have one question for you, Michael. Perhaps it's unfair, and I should wait until Lydia comes to one of our future meetings. But Ford mentioned how the potential for the outer neighborhoods with no caps on Airbnb rentals for adjacent units could lead to an offsetting influx of short-term rentals in those neighborhoods. And the cap on that would have sort of curtailed some of that expansion of short-term rentals was narrowly defeated in the city council by a vote of 7-6. And surprisingly, Lydia voted against the 120-day cap. Can you speak as to what her rationale was for not supporting the 120-day cap?
The council said anyone with any questions on the 120-day cap, I can take your name and phone number and she will call you personally.
Well, there you have it. And perhaps when she comes to one of our next meetings, she can.
You're right.
All right, well, with that, we're going to conclude the
Can I say one thing?
Oh, quickly.
I just want to say, I want to thank everyone here because NEWRA sent a letter, and I know that back about a year ago, we first introduced this, and you guys, so I really want to thank everyone. We also want to say, a lot of you participated in the email campaign. We were being out-emailed by Airbnb One 8 to 1 3 weeks ago. There were 750 pro Airbnb, don't regulate us, versus only about 150, let's have regulations. And, I know that the folks in this room did it, all the other neighborhood associations did it. I was very happy to find out from the City Hall folks that it was 10 to 1. We beat them in the last 3 weeks, and we actually got more emails saying we want regulation than Airbnb, all their professional lobbyists and the millions of dollars they spent. We got more emails out. Thank you guys. It's great to get all the neighborhoods working together. So, appreciate it.